Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming-events.htm.
Much for coming back, and welcome to Dr. Calvin Coker.
Evening. I really appreciate y'all coming out here and braving the cold. So the way that tonight is going to work is it's going to be similar to the prior class with a couple of caveats. The first is there's going to be some recaps of information. And the reason is because that information, it's not important necessarily that you have it like exactly on tap, but there's a through line in terms of how argument has become a little bit more difficult. And obviously the conversation that we had this last Tuesday, it kind of resembled that conversation. So first, a recap, a reminder. Last week, we talked a lot about polarization. We talked essentially about our current political sphere and how not only do we dislike the political other, but also there are genuine differences in terms of ideological preferences. We also know that there are confounding factors, like conspiracy theories, that make argument significantly harder for us to sort of navigate on an interpersonal level. So we talked about that, and I'll give you a little bit of the recap, including some of the strategies that we talked about to maybe navigate argument a little bit more successfully. Tonight, we're going to be talking about good faith argument, and specifically moving away from our entirely defensible, but kind of negative tendencies as they pertain to argument. Nobody is born being good at this. And as such, if we isolate maybe some of these tendencies that subvert productive argument, or that maybe in our natural state would keep us from engaging in good faith, I think that we will be in a better spot. Although much of that conversation is going to be directed towards the self, what can we be doing to engage in good faith? It will also be addressing the nebulous problem of the bad faith actor and what we should be doing in order to engage them. Next week, we will talk about emotion in argument, how we can, I always hesitate to say contain, because emotion has a place in argument. It's an entirely rational construct in a vast majority of instances. And yet we think about emotion as clouding argument or making it significantly harder. So to preview next week, we will be complicating that understanding of emotion and trying to work towards, well, when can emotion be relevant in argument, and how can we effectively work around those parameters? And then finally, we'll conclude at the end of the month talking about structures of power and how those ultimately influence our argument encounters. So just again, as a recap, we talked a fair bit about political polarization, meaning the distance between, say, members of the red team and members of the blue team. And there are a bunch of different ways that we can measure political polarization. And all of them suggest ideological polarization, affective polarization, heck, even geographic polarization. Increasingly, Americans are moving to places that are more kind of politically homogenous for themselves. There are increasingly meaningful geographic divides that actually map onto our politics. We talked about how that makes argument harder because it encourages us to make assumptions. If you're a member of the red team and you really don't encounter members of the blue team very often, you have a mental image of them nonetheless. You have an imagination of what a Democrat would be if you are a Republican, and vice versa. And as such, that imagination can actually structure the way that we approach encounters. Because if you imagine this person believes this thing, and they believe it for this reason, that is, of course, going to inform your preparation. How would you engage that person if they did believe those things, and if that was the reason that they believed them? However, one of the conclusions was that we're not actually correct very often in those assumptions. Until folks give us a reason to actually believe these are the things that they believe, or these are the reasons that they believe them, we should probably resist our urge to engage in those assumptions about our conversation partner. And that dovetails very nicely with a conversation on good faith. Keep in mind also that some of these base level strategies will be very effective in making it so that argument can be much more productive. And I will remind you what we mean by productive argument on the next slide. Keep in mind that you yourself are not infallible. You're actually not objective either. I'm not saying that we shouldn't strive for some version of objectivity. I'm not saying that we shouldn't quarantine our biases, but that's not our resting pulse. If you're engaged with someone and they're accusing you of bias, it's possible that that is, yes, just an accusation. But it's also possible that they are correctly identifying a problem in your logic in terms of how you were being self-interested or how maybe your blinders had somehow created an interpretation of facts or an interpretation of an argument that could be a problem. So that's the first thing. Make sure that you are containing your own biases. Second, cut against your own assumptions regarding your conversation partners. We've largely covered that, and I think that we will expand it today. Third, you actually need to work to defend your own opinions. This is sometimes where, especially when I'm talking to students about this, we run into some problems because they would immediately think, wait, I shouldn't have to defend everything. If I don't like Brussels sprouts, if I don't like artichokes, I shouldn't have to defend that they taste like dirt or something like that. But those are questions of taste. And questions of taste are not exactly something that we can end up arguing about. My partner dislikes onions immensely, and there is no amount of argument that can convince her that the texture of an onion is actually palatable. It's entirely reasonable. It belongs in chili. These are not things that will actually fall upon hearing ears. They're questions of taste. Not everything is a question of taste. If you were going to advocate, for example, that the state of Kentucky should adopt XYZ different adjustments to education in the state, there should be a reason for those things. And I'm not saying that because I believe the status quo is defensible or whatever it happens to be, but when we're talking about collective action, when we're talking about ideas that impact other people, you have an obligation to defend yourself if that sort of encroachment on other people becomes very apparent. And that is a standard that we should hold others to as well. And then finally, and this is probably the most relevant part tonight, some folks are not worth engaging. And I don't mean that you write them off out of the gate. I don't mean that you develop in your mind a sense of a person and think, that is a person who I will not argue with, or that is a kind of person, a genre of person who I will not be engaging. Rather, I would encourage you to, when folks are not being responsive to your attempts to navigate towards productive argument, to navigate towards good faith, when they are not responsive to being held accountable or to engaging argument in the way that you feel actually could be most productive, it's possible that that lack of willingness is an index of something deeper. And not everyone ultimately is going to engage you on your terms. Now, at a minimum, this should be an excuse for you not to get into arguments on Facebook. Like, you don't need to argue with those folks. Maybe it's productive, maybe it's a good idea, but it definitely could turn the temperature up in a way that we don't like. And as such, we need to ask ourselves, well, when would I break away? The answer last week concerned productive argument, which I will remind you features these things: the consent of those individuals who are participating, buy-in to any sort of eventual outcome that the disagreement may manifest as, even if that's not the side that wins. So if you were engaged in an argument and it just goes sideways for you, you get absolutely none of what you want. A productive argument would still presuppose you've bought into that. You have accepted that premise, that as a possible outcome of the argument, this is technically acceptable. There are also moments in which willingness to change one's mind is a hallmark of productive argument. Because if two parties are unable to change their mind, we need to ask what the purpose of the argument is. Now, not every argument actually has to manifest in behavioral change or in ideas being changed. I'm thinking of just 90 miles up the road, we have the Young Earth Institute and the Creationism Museum, right? Ken Ham had a public debate with Bill Nye, the science guy, notable public science advocate. Bill Nye was not going to change his mind, and neither would Ken Ham, who is an evangelical Christian who believes very specific things about answers being in Genesis, the name of his foundation. But the existence of that debate, that actually could influence other folks' minds. It's well within the realm of possibility that productive argument doesn't require a change of mind. But at a base level, when we're thinking interpersonally, if you're not willing to, that's probably a reason that there is something going on that we ought to interrogate. And finally, we are trying to minimize argument tactics which tend to end an argument without actually leading to resolution. I'm thinking of those interpersonal squabbles where somehow it's not actually about the thing that you were arguing about. You begin with a relatively simple to resolve proposition, and then ultimately you're arguing about something that occurred 7 months ago or something along those lines. The reason that that's not productive is almost like evident, because it creates a world in which individuals are, yes, engaged in argument, but not to the end that people had previously talked about. And as such, the animating question for tonight, and perhaps the thing that we need to keep in mind as we go through a conversation about good and bad faith, is how can we ensure that we cut against our worst tendencies, while also encouraging others to adopt strategies that are consonant with maybe some of the precepts of a course like this, or really just our understanding of what a productive argument could be. And I suggest that a modification of productive argument is thinking about arguing in good faith. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term good faith, or the Latin bona fides. It's a notion that has most application actually in things like contract law. Because if two parties enter into a contract, there is a presupposition that both parties will be attempting to uphold the contract. They will engage in what we would characterize as good faith attempts to ensure that that contract can be maximally beneficial to both parties. At the very minimum, there is a presupposition that the contract that we've signed, the thing that we've agreed to, that is something that we are going to honor until it eventually becomes renegotiated or something along those lines. The Cato Institute, which is a slightly right-leaning but largely non-partisan not-for-profit, argues that good faith argument features both parties agreeing on the terms on which they engage. This is comparable, I would say, to the notion of both parties are consenting. They are honest and respectful of the other person's dignity, which perhaps is a loaded kind of term, but this is presupposing the valid existence of the other person and a treatment of that individual and their beliefs as something that a reasonable person would come to, even if at first blush they appear unreasonable. According to Cato, good faith would require following generally accepted norms of social interaction. It's always kind of funny to me when people are interacting on Facebook as though it's like not public or not like a manifestation of yourself. It's like, listen, I know that some folks treat social media as a diary. I've had a Twitter account. I get how that works. But there are moments in which folks violate long-standing social decorum in terms of name calling, in terms of caps lock being on, which is understood really to be a raised voice in textual form, or perhaps simply just being uncharitable and unreasonable, engaging at times where you simply would not treat somebody sitting in front of you like that. According to Cato, that violation of social standards constitutes a moment in which that argument is not being conducted in good faith. And finally, there is the notion that we genuinely want to hear what the other person thinks and has to say. Let's take a moment and realize that that's really where the rub is. Because there are some ideologies, there are some arguments, there are some things where, because of a whole constellation of different factors, including but not limited to political polarization and our own sort of partisan biases, we don't actually want to hear the other side. That's justifiable in some ways, because when we have politics indexed so closely to morality, when we have politics sort of with the temperature at 11, and if you don't feel like we're there yet, just wait until August. Like we gonna get there. It's gonna be a warm year in that way. That suggests we actually don't want to hear the other side. But perhaps if you take nothing away from this evening, that contention that the way to engage in good faith, and perhaps a linchpin to productive argument, is genuinely being invested in what the other person has to say, that is a massive way to alter the argumentative playing field. And we'll talk about strategies to maybe get there, but please consider the following. Most people, yourself included, are smart. they have reasons to believe the things that they believe. And very often, when someone comes to a conclusion, they did not actually do so lightly. There are plenty of times where we come to a conclusion lightly because it doesn't really matter to us, right? But in those instances, if somebody prompted us to interrogate, well, why actually do you feel that way? That would be a moment for personal introspection. And would also probably be pretty fascinating in terms of how a person came to the conclusion that they did. According to Cato, that's what good faith argument looks like. And that's really the direction that I'm encouraging you to go. We would like to see more good faith engagement generally. And I say we here as like the American populace, but also like an educational community that studies argument. Good faith engagement is something that is really the linchpin to turning the temperature down. And we're not quite there. And the reason is that that's moderately difficult. How precisely do we actually get in our way of good faith engagement? Well, there's a couple of different things that we all do. And it seems likely that if we're doing it, so too would our conversation partner. And the first is that we make assumptions about our partner's intentions. Now, in communication, we typically talk about how we cannot know intentions. They're unknowable. It is a black box. We don't know intentions, we only really know impacts, and we know people's actions. And as such, that's oftentimes what we end up talking about. But intentions clearly matter, even if they are unintelligible to us. If we believe that intentions matter, but they are not knowable in the traditional sense, all that's really left for us to do is make assumptions. But that creates its own problems. Why is a person against, like, the bills in Florida that altered the nature of parents' relationships to curriculum? Are they against those bills because they don't believe that the legislature should be influencing that degree of control? Are they against those bills because they firmly believe that third graders should be exposed to age-inappropriate content? What are the intentions of your opposition, essentially? And frankly, that question would structure how you would engage them. When we make assumptions about other folks' intentions, we're actually beginning the argument without the partner in a lot of ways. And that can set us up to fail, because there are plenty of instances in which somebody's support for a policy is not actually for the reason that you think. There are other instances where we actually fail to respect why somebody would draw the conclusion that they do. I was speaking with somebody at the gym earlier today. There was a very talkative person in the sauna, which is, as an aside, don't do that. Like, don't just talk to people while you're working out, but that's neither here nor there. This person was talking about how their neighbor started believing in flat Earth. They got onto YouTube and they kind of became a little bit convinced that the Earth was flat. This is a robust online community by a lot of different metrics. And this person's contention was, I didn't realize that my neighbor was an idiot. Now, okay, first blush, understandable, right? Like, of all of the things that we are taught, the Earth being round is normally like near the top, right? So the notion that there is a community of folks who believe that the Earth is flat, that is perplexing. And we feel as though it's an indictment of their intelligence. But that actually doesn't isolate why somebody would be skeptical or participate in like a flat Earth conversation. Maybe it has as much to do with community as it does with the actual content of the question. Maybe it is simply a fun puzzle that they are trying to solve. And they're not truly an adherent. They're not trying to alter school boards. They just happen to have this particular thought that they pursue. If we do not respect that somebody could engage in something like flat Earth conspiracy theories for reasons that have nothing to do with intelligence, we are starting off on the wrong foot, and we're not engaged in good faith deliberation at that time. There are also moments in which we violate the terms of engagement preemptively. We've all been in this moment where we are engaging a person who we know can take this to 11. We know that they are volatile. We know that the way that they will approach the conversation may eventually spiral out of control. But instead of giving them the opportunity to continue to moderate, to continue to be regulated, we may just begin the debate at 11. We may begin with all of the argumentative tactics, the yelling, the screaming, the things that we would typically associate with a knockdown, drag-out kind of brawl. because we assume that our opponent is going to engage in those same tactics, and we don't want to be the ones left holding the bag. That's its own problem. Now, again, I'm not saying be gullible. I'm not saying that you should ignore past signs, but I am saying that we shouldn't necessarily begin at 11. And finally, we may not be interested in what the other party has to say. So, as a researcher, I look at public policy rhetoric. That's a thing that I tend to write about a fair bit. And it's hard to write about public policy without developing an understanding of those policies and eventually like a valence, a preference in terms of how those policies go. And sometimes I forget that I'm deep enough in this literature. I've been reading about this stuff for literal years that when I engage someone who has the opposite viewpoint of me, my immediate thought might be, this person does not know what they are talking about. They have not read this 2011 book about the criminalization of welfare or something like that. It's like, yeah, of course they haven't. Why would they have that back file? Why would they have that knowledge? If we are unwilling to listen to folks and the reasons that they came to the conclusions that they did, we are foreclosing on the possibility of good faith argument before we even get there. Now, all of this requires work. All of these elements, cutting against our assumptions, making sure that we are giving space for people to voice why they would think a particular thing, making sure that we are not essentially running over them and just waiting for our turn to talk. These are things we have to practice. These are not our natural resting pulses. And as such, we need to be thinking about how we can make sure these kinds of elements don't end up precluding what we would characterize as good faith engagement. Now, this is an instance where I'm going to keep talking about good faith engagement and productive argument, but it's kind of significant that we talk about bad faith. Like, what do we mean by bad faith in this context? And by the way, I apologize for using the same graphic. I found it very difficult to create a good textual, like a good image representation of what bad faith would be. Like, abstract concepts in Google Image don't really work very well together, so sorry about that. We'll talk about what we mean by bad faith and also how we got to this moment where, honestly, you all have a reasonable suspicion that a conversation partner would be engaged in some version of bad faith. So again, leaning on the Cato Institute, arguing in bad faith refers to a discussion in which one or both parties has a hidden, unrevealed agenda. And very often, that agenda actually concerns the manipulation or the coercion of one's conversation partner to a particular position. This is a moment where I kind of want to bust out the persuasion theory stuff. The significant difference between being persuaded and being coerced is that persuasion very often relies on an individual coming to a conclusion based off of a set of criteria that they have elaborated on themselves. Coercion, however, is very often the use of force or the use of blackmail, creating a world where a person realistically cannot make another choice. If there was a choice, it was kind of in name only. We also know that bad faith features a lack of basic respect for the rights, dignities, and autonomy of the other party. Jean-Paul Sartre makes the argument that bad faith abounds specifically in ideologies that negate the existence of others. A Nazi is incapable of engaging in good faith with a conversation of a person who they believe to fundamentally be inferior. And the reason is that if a Nazi was to have their way, that person would no longer exist. That's a massive problem. Because if you're entering a conversation believing fundamentally or having some element of your ideology believe fundamentally that your conversation partner is not entitled to a place at the table, we have begun from an untenable position. Because what are you supposed to do aside from show that person the door, or in turn be showed the door yourself? When we consider what bad faith is and what it can look like, we have to kind of ask, well, all right, this is definitely a thing, but it's not necessarily something that we encounter all that often. Like maybe you have a family member who always has a hidden, unrevealed agenda or something along those lines. Or maybe you actually have engaged with a person who did not have a fundamental or basic respect for you as a person. If that's the case, I'm sorry. But generally, we don't actually encounter stuff like this. And yet, bad faith very much abounds in the public sphere. And I've isolated, I think, 3 reasons why that can give us a sense of why people may engage in a way that is not conducive to good faith argumentation. First, this was an allusion that was actually made by some folks in the front row last week, which is that when we treat argument as a competition, we can very often justify tactics or justify strategies which tend to cut against good faith argument. If, for example, we treat argument as something with a winner and a loser, you very much want to be the winner. And it's within the realm of possibility that that would encourage you to engage in novel strategies, things like deception, or things like attempting to coerce your conversation partner to your way of being because winning is really what matters. And we see this happen over and over again. But Mehdi Hasan, who is, I believe, a former CNN anchor, I think he just recently resigned his post, he wrote a book called Win Every Argument, The Art of Debating, Persuading, and Public Speaking. And although Hasan is not making the argument that you can literally win every argument, he's framing it as winners and losers. That contention will color and will structure the way that we ultimately engage the encounter. But perhaps the more important thing that makes bad faith, at the very least, more likely, is that very often engaging a debate in bad faith is not meaningfully punished. I'm thinking of individuals like Christopher Ruffo. Ruffo is a conservative activist who has openly said on Twitter what his media strategy is. I don't know if you're familiar with the recent resignation of Harvard President Claudine Gay, but that resignation came at the end of a relatively coordinated campaign from Ruffo's camp. And he specified on Twitter, here is what we are going to do. We are going to say critical race theory. We're going to use these phrases that have a negative valence within right-wing spaces. We're going to move these accusations into mainstream media, talk about them under the guise of anti-Semitism, use things like the congressional hearing on anti-Semitism to paint these folks as radicals, and then, upon being treated as radicals, we call for their resignation. This sounds like a conspiracy, but Ruffo laid it out. The tweets still exist. This is a person who not only is telling us, this is my strategy to score points. This is how I am securing the resignations of what I perceive to be high-profile people. And yet, when Ruffo engages, it's not just that people are saying, you're a partisan hack, you're an actor, you're engaging in a very specific project that perhaps we all would not agree to. They actually treat him as a legitimate commentator. And there are other times where engaging in bad faith is actively rewarded. The rewards for engaging in a version of bad faith actually correspond with outrage journalism. They correspond with increased clicks, increased likes, the ability for people to essentially say, I am destroying these folks in debate, when in reality that debate was not anything that we would characterize as productive. I don't know if you're familiar, for example, with Live Action, which is James Deladian or Deladian. I've only ever seen his name in text, so I can't recall how to pronounce it. That's his organization that routinely has done undercover stings of, say, Planned Parenthood locations. Live Action was also responsible for the 2008 Acorn situation, which is a little bit of political ephemera. It was essentially like a voter registration scandal. And Deladian, regardless of how you feel about his partisan motives, is almost always engaging in bad faith because he's engaging in deceptive tactics that then ultimately use deception to reframe his findings in the public sphere. You may agree with everything that Deladian has said, but the method is not just problematic. It's also never meaningfully punished. And this individual is still floating around in the public sphere. He's treated seriously. Now, there are moments in which we think this is these are talking heads. These are just abstract people. I'm never going to meet these folks. There's no reason to suspect that other individuals will engage in bad faith. And yet, there will be times in which emulation is very much going to occur. And the example of this is a previously mentioned person, Steven Crowder. Steven Crowder is the originating impulse for the change my mind meme, where he's sitting at a table, there's a contention that is controversial, and then change my mind is underneath it. Crowder is a conservative activist. And this notion, there are only two genders, change my mind, it's within the realm of possibility that you could have a debate about like the biological reality of genders versus the social construction of gender norms and those kinds of things. Like that is a debate that we are having as a society. And there is a way to engage that debate that does not fundamentally invalidate the existence and the livelihood of trans folks. We can have that conversation, perhaps. The way that Crowder is engaging it is not that. Because here's the game. Here's the rope-a-dope strategy. Crowder has this argument, and he has a series of contentions that are kind of hard to rebut, talking about biological realities, talking about specific scientific information that a vast majority of folks probably don't have on tap. And then when college students come up to him, because he targets college campuses, to change his mind, he's able to capture them on camera getting flustered. There are other folks who engage in this kind of strategy. There was a recent prank, for example, at the Iowa caucuses, where I think Ron DeSantis was given a participation trophy. Pretty mean-spirited, not actually conducive to productive debate. Yes, he placed a distant second in Iowa, but that does not require a public event. They engaged in the public event for clicks, for likes, for clout, because there is a genuine economic and social incentive to engage in that kind of pithy outrage. That's very much what Crowder is doing in a lot of different ways. And the problem is that it's not just Steven Crowder. This is not just a pet project where he will randomly show up on your college campus. This is actually a component of broader organizations like Turning Point USA, which use this content as a way to support their broader contentions, and also to support painting with a broad brush as it pertains to a particular population. That notion is not engaging in good faith. If Crowder actually wanted to have a version of this debate, this certainly wouldn't be the way to go about it. And yet, when folks are encountering debate in online mediated spaces, this is the kind of thing that they're seeing. They're seeing folks who are, yes, engaging, but it's for the purpose of trickery. It's for the purpose of engaging, not to necessarily change minds, but to farm an individual for content. Now, the way that this impacts argument is myriad, but I would argue at a minimum, bad faith entails breaking a contract for some form of advantage. And as such, there is an incentive to break from established norms. There will be moments when you are having arguments and you realize you could say something that is profoundly uncharitable, that very much violates social norms, that perhaps even alters the trajectory of the argument. And in the moment, you are going to be tempted to do that because it will feel like winning. That is an impulse that you should resist for a bunch of different reasons. But at a minimum, the reason that you should resist it is that that alters the contours of the argument without actually resolving it in any meaningful way. If there is an incentive for you to shut down the debate, you may end up trying to do it. And that is one of the reasons that bad faith is such a problem. Second, we know that bad faith can be modeled. If we do not have a robust understanding of argument, if it hasn't been shown to us, we're cobbling stuff together. Folks don't take debate classes in high school. They don't take them in middle school. They don't take them in college. Frankly, my UofL requires all communication students to take a class called Argument in Everyday Life. And it is one of the few institutions I've ever been at that requires a class that has argument in the title for its majors. It's not very common. It's viewed as a niche activity. But folks like Crowder, folks like Ben Shapiro, folks like the individuals who trolled Ron DeSantis, they very much exist in online spaces. They exist on TikTok in bite-sized forms of content. They exist in media ecosystems like Facebook, which are actually uniquely suited for the re-articulation of these kinds of points. And as such, it's possible that people's only exposure to argument is modeled bad faith. And finally, bad faith actors are actually under no obligation to take the whole enterprise seriously. Sartre's argument about Nazis wasn't just that bad faith was abounding and keeping an argument from being possible. It was also that individuals who look at an argument encounter and say, I don't have to win. I don't have to engage meaningfully, because just by engaging, I'm getting something. Those individuals are able to engage in what Sartre called play. They're able to alter the contours of the argument and warp it in such a way that becomes indistinguishable, because the debate becomes about something else. You could have a good faith debate about curriculum reform in a place like Florida. But in a place like Florida, that curriculum reform bill, the Parental Rights in Education Act, it was talked about as a bill to prevent grooming in K through 12 education. That is profoundly not what that debate did. That is not what that bill was about. And to frame it in that way was a relatively novel exercise in making something unattractive. Nobody is going to say, I am for the sexual manipulation of minors. That's not a thing. Nobody is pro-grooming. And as such, the contours of the debate shifted in a way that was profoundly advantageous to one side while also being deceptive. Very, very misleading. And there are clear reasons why that might be the case. But good faith is actually possible. There is a bunch of reasons to suspect that even though bad faith does abound, and it is a very public thing that makes argument harder, we can do better. And to demonstrate this, I've actually got a politician. His name is Jeff Jackson. He is the Democratic representative from North Carolina. And there is a small TikTok that came out right after he was elected to office, which actually addressed perhaps some foundational elements of the good and bad faith conversation that we're having. The text is on the video, so you should be able to follow along. We were having a little bit of audio issue, but we're going to see if we can make it work. We good?
I'm still brand new to Congress. I've only been there 100 days. And I don't know if I'm not supposed to say this out loud, but it's true and important. And if you don't know this, you need to. It's really clear from working there for just a few months that most of the really angry voices in Congress are totally faking it. These people who have built their brands around being perpetually outraged, it's an act. I've seen a bunch of examples. Here's one. I've been in committee meetings that are open to the press and committee meetings that are closed. The same people who act like maniacs during the open meetings are suddenly calm and rational during the closed ones. Why? Because there aren't any cameras in the closed meetings, so their incentives are different. What I've seen is that members of Congress are surrounded by negative incentives. There are rewards for bad behavior. You know what the big one is? Being able to reach you. The big thing that modern media and modern politicians have learned is that if they can keep you angry, they'll hold your attention. And they both want your attention. So if you're a politician and you show certain media outlets that you can help them keep their audience angry, they'll give you their audience. And because so many politicians are willing to play that game, now they're in competition with each other to see how fake angry they can be. So that's real bad. But here's something good. What I love about this, about communicating with you directly, is that the incentives are different. They can be positive. They can be about speaking to you with respect and real information and in a normal tone of voice. Because if I can talk to you directly, I don't have to yell. And if you don't have to yell to be heard, the whole conversation changes. So going forward, when you hear some enraged member of Congress say something absurd, your first question shouldn't be, how can they possibly believe that? It should be, do we think they actually do? Because they probably don't. And for those who want to see politics look less like WWE, I will keep you posted.
Jackson's whole online persona is actually built on this notion that if we engage folks in what we would call like a traditionally civil way. This is adhering to all of, I would say, the typical social expectations that we would have in an interpersonal context. It is a way of breaking down what would otherwise be a problem in a mediated political environment. We talked last week about how even though I work at UofL, a place where Mitch McConnell will routinely occur, I have never encountered a wild Mitch McConnell. I have only ever encountered a mediated vision of him. And as such, I have a bunch of assumptions about that particular actor that it's very hard to disabuse myself of them. Jackson is making the argument that if we are able to break down sort of the pretense, the performance, and in doing so also isolate why there may be incentives for people to act these ways, we can actually cut through elements of the noise. Now, I'm not saying that Jackson is single-handedly ushering in civility, but he is pointing out something that I think a lot of people suspected, but it's very difficult to ascertain, which is that when the temperature is at 11, we kind of have to ask, why? How did we get to this moment? How did we get to this time where everybody appears to be so outraged or so angry, and in doing so, it makes argument incredibly difficult? Jackson is, I think, a great demonstration of how good faith engagement from elites, it is possible. But we don't even have to look to elites. We can be thinking about our individual lives as instances in which good faith clearly has and will continue to occur. By example, Americans are less polarized than we think. And the average person does not hold all of, or even most of, the ideas that we may attribute to them. The example that we used last week was on gun control, where a majority of Democrats and a plurality, under 50%, but I believe over 40% of Republicans, were largely in agreement about the need for something like a national gun registry or the banning of assault-style weapons. There may be differences in terms of the priorities that we attach to that. It's possible that one political party may identify gun violence as a pressing public health crisis, and the other may isolate it as something of a lower importance. But people are still largely in agreement. It's not that you have one camp that wants to ban all guns and one camp that believes gun ownership should be mandatory. There is clearly a middle ground, and in that middle ground, we can actually isolate moments not only for compromise and bipartisanship and all of those pleasant words that we like to think about, but we can also actually get to a space where we are identifying why somebody feels the way that they do, and maybe the opportunity for some sort of alteration to those ideas. We also know that folks like Jackson are pointing out the gamification of media environments. Honestly, if you're running a national level political campaign at this moment, the best thing that you can do, the most advantageous, most probably bang for your buck thing would be to invest in an individual who is conscious of existing media trends and knows how to get journalists to listen to you. Because I don't have anything against journalists, but in many ways, they're part of a broken system that encourages them to report on things that say one thing, but may actually end up going a different direction. By example, Donald Trump picked up 50.7% or something like that of the Iowa caucuses. And part of that had to do with the fact that Trump has been talked about as the presumptive nominee for literal months. Now, I'm not saying that the media has anointed Trump as the nominee well beforehand, because we actually know that very often media sources are not good at that. Fox News anointed Ted Cruz in 2016. That didn't work out. There have always been conversations about, say, Democratic frontrunners. In the primary in 2020, there was this conversation about Pete Buttigieg, who is, yes, in political office. He's the transportation secretary, but clearly he didn't do well in places like New Hampshire. It's not that the media is capable of anointing folks. It's instead that the narratives that they have, they actually follow very similar trajectories. We talked last week about CNN having a conflict bias, not necessarily a partisan bias, but framing things in terms of a horse race or in terms of one side does one thing, one side does another, they're clashing, and we have experts from both camps. That does not allow for an actual honest-to-goodness assessment of things like policy or, frankly, of a nuanced conversation about the nature of American politics in the modern day. So when elite actors point out that many, many media sources are broken in the way that they consider attention, in the way that they devote resources to particular kinds of coverage and remove those resources from other places, we actually have the possibility that things are genuinely going to change. And the final part of this, perhaps the thing that's going to hit closest to home, is that we can pull family members back from the brink. If you have a member of your family who, frankly, is flirting with conspiracy theories like QAnon, it's possible to intervene. And it's possible to have a conversation with them. Not one that indicts their intelligence, not one that rejects the validity or the veracity of their claims, but instead one that attempts to listen and say, why precisely have you gone down this rabbit hole? What is it about this that's persuasive to you? And have you considered these alternatives? And I understand that perhaps with QAnon that feels daunting. Like if you have an honest-to-goodness conspiracy theory member in your household, that may seem like it would be very, very difficult to engage. But to talk about a totally not polarizing topic, consider vaccination rates for things like COVID-19. There were many folks who got the vaccines when they first came out, and there were many folks who, understandably, decided to wait just a little bit. There may still be members of your family who are actively rejecting attempts to have a conversation about a COVID vaccination. We can actually reach folks like that. And there are a bunch of different ways that we can do so. My grandparents on my wife's side, they were not interested in like re-upping the battery of childhood vaccines after our child was born. And ultimately, we made the determination, listen, you don't have to agree with this, but this is a barrier to entry. Like, you're not going to be able to interact with this child because she doesn't really have an immune system, like most babies don't, unless you do X, Y, Z things. In a sense, that was coercive, but that was actually enough to demonstrate to these folks, no, we're actually serious about this. Like, this matters a great deal, and we need you to take it seriously. In that moment, just by conveying the importance of a particular thing, we were able to kind of reach somebody who would not have otherwise been reached. And so too can these things happen on heavily polarizing topics like vaccinations or something like the acceptance of a family member's life or something along those lines. When we consider good faith being possible, when we consider all of these externalities and all of these moments, we need to be asking ourselves, well, okay, bad faith abounds, but how do we truly get to this point where good faith is our resting pulse? Or how do we get to a moment in which when we are engaging folks, we can presuppose good faith of them? Well, there's a couple of things that I think we need to do. Every single class, as previously mentioned, I'm going to isolate some strategies which are going to intersect with the problems that we've highlighted here. Again, there is no cure-all. One of the difficulties about teaching argument and about thinking about argument is that there are a lot of contextual elements. There are a lot of externalities that you would have to compensate for. But that does not mean that we cannot strive to strike bad tendencies from ourselves and maybe work a little bit more towards engaging others. We will talk about how good faith argument maybe doesn't solve all of the problems, but it's probably going to solve a lot of the problems that you had in mind as you were entering a class like this. So, how should we understand good faith, and how should that actually change our behavior? I apologize for the lot of text. I will get through this in such a way that hopefully will be intelligible. At a minimum, if we don't have a bunch of evidence otherwise, we ought to assume that folks are engaging us in good faith. And we should begin from the presupposition that we are as well. Fundamentally, arguments are about changes in opinions, or changes in beliefs, changes in structures and ideologies and all manner of different things. We have to give folks the opportunity to change their beliefs. Frankly, I think one of the reasons that some folks are not getting, for example, a COVID vaccine is at this point, they feel pot committed. If they did not get it at all of these times, just because we have yet another surge, that's not going to be enough to persuade them, because there are a bunch of things that are attached to vaccination that are politically valenced, that are socially valenced, that are religiously valenced, and now that ship may have sailed. But we don't actually know that. We can't say that with confidence. If we are engaging someone and we genuinely want to know what they believe and what they think, and that is specifically towards the end of perhaps altering that behavior, changing that behavior in some capacity, we need to give them the opportunity to do so. And we need to at least have them understand the social consequences of their view. Because there are some folks who want to hold what we would characterize as retrograde or deleterious ideologies, and they need to know that that probably will mean that we don't want them at our dinner party. Like, I don't know how you feel about, like, on a national level, immigration policy or something along those lines. But there are ways that we can argue about immigration policy which don't involve the demonization of immigrants or the invocation of xenophobic rhetoric and hatred towards immigrants. And as such, if somebody is anti-immigration and they're using that kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric, we kind of need to give them an opportunity to explain why. Like, is the core of your objection to immigration actually about the non-white other, or is it rooted in something else? Giving people the opportunity to clarify, giving them the opportunity to voice their intentions and their thoughts, that is absolutely a first step that we need to do, even if that is uncomfortable. We also need to begin the argument not at the end, which is thinking, how can I get this person to change their mind? How can I get this person to change their behavior? And instead beginning from a position of empathy and understanding. We should be asking ourselves, how did you come to that conclusion? And I don't mean that in like a paternalistic or a condescending way. Like, oh, how did you come to that conclusion? No, genuinely, what are the things that you encountered that encouraged you to feel that way? Sometimes when folks are saying, oh, well, I heard it on the news. Which news? What precisely are we talking about here? Because if you are under the impression that XYZ things are true about our political or our social moment, you probably didn't invent those things yourself. You got that information from somewhere. And a good faith conversation partner would actually begin to suss those things out and possibly identify them as a source of conflict or a source of tension. Because partisan media environments, they encourage us to think that the other side is engaged in literal fake news, disinformation, misinformation. And this is not just endemic to one partisan side. This is actually true across the political spectrum. And as such, if we begin the conversation with, how did you come to that conclusion? We can begin to suss out, like, wait, what is your media diet? What research have you been doing? Like, you've clearly thought about this. What is the content of that thought? And how might I intervene is the wrong word because, again, that is paternalistic. But how can I fit into that? How can I better understand the things that you happen to be saying and believing, which feel so alien and so unintelligible to me? We also need to remember that good faith does not require you to be gullible. There's a literary theorist named Kenneth Burke who made the argument that we ought to be giving people the cosmic discount. We ought to assume that all humans are fundamentally fallible. We are all going to mess up at some point, but that doesn't mean that you have to blindly accept folks. In the same way that there are blind spots that we have, everybody's got a blind spot. There's an old joke from How I Met Your Mother where one of the characters believes that reindeers are not real. They're mythical creatures. The joke, of course, is that they do exist. Reindeers are a thing. They just don't happen to fly. And that's a blind spot, right? This is an objectively intelligent character who happens to have this little moment, this little lacuna in their thinking that encouraged them to adopt an embarrassing stance. We should probably give them the benefit of the doubt. We shouldn't assume they thought that because they are an idiot, that there's some sort of intellectual deficit or some sort of major problem. Or to apply it to modern day politics, we ought to not assume that an individual is for or against a particular policy because they have a particular moral or religious stance or something along those lines. But Maya Angelou made a good argument that we should probably heed, and that is that when people tell you who they are, you ought to listen. There are moments in which the way that an individual engages you is perhaps all the information you need about whether or not this is going to be a good faith conversation partner. Because I truly believe that a vast majority of folks are interested in a conversation that involves empathy, that involves understanding, that involves an opportunity to voice why you feel a particular way, and then be met perhaps with opposition that says, have you considered actually thinking this way? I think a vast majority of folks would be open to that if they could guarantee their own kind of safety within it. Maybe that's optimistic. But in circumstances in which an individual like Christopher Ruffo, like Steven Crowder, is very clearly engaged in a stunt, you don't have to give them the time of day. In that way, this is how we can begin to change our behavior to move a little bit more towards good faith. But that's not very concrete. That doesn't give you, I think, a good sense of like, okay, if you were to like put down on a notepad, what am I supposed to do with this? Here's where we are. How can we personally act in good faith? And I actually want to like separate this conversation a little bit. There's going to be one slide, which is how can we do this? The internally focused stuff. How can we alter our own trajectories, our own tendencies? And then also, how can we encourage this in others? So first, how can we make sure we are acting in good faith? You need to hold yourself to a high standard. Like that at the bottom is perhaps the area that most people can improve. What are your standards for evidence? And I don't mean that in like an academic sense. Like I'm not grading your essays. It's much more like when you draw a conclusion or when you make a decision, what is the like moment at which you are ready to commit to something? What's the tipping point for you? What kind of evidence do you accept? What kind of places do you trust? You ought to have a high standard for yourself. And we're all going to slip. Sometimes there is something being said on TikTok that it sounds legitimate. It's entirely consonant with other like national level social trends or political trajectories. And yet it is bunk. It is not accurate. It is not verified. And in those circumstances, we ought to hold ourselves to two kinds of high standards. The first is when something is consequential, these kinds of big if true statements, we need to verify that they're true. We need to triangulate them. We need to seek out other forms of media that can perhaps confirm or deny the nature of this information. In research, that's called triangulation. It's finding, essentially, support for the things, yes, that we already know, but it's verifying this is a largely agreed upon fact. In the same way that we hold ourselves to a high standard for evidence, you got to hold yourself to a high standard in terms of decorum. There will be two people in an argument. They will both have a moment at which they are going to flip their lid. I need you to keep your lid a little bit more firmly secured than your conversation partner. This is going to be hard. We do not teach people emotional regulation. That is simply not a skill that a vast majority of us inherited from our parents or learned. And as such, in moments where it could go off the rails, you ought to attempt to maintain composure. And there are a number of different strategies that you can adopt in order to do that, including grounding techniques that focus on breathing, or just attempting to make it so that there is a moment in which I could become angry and I am making an active choice not to. You should also be realistic in your goals, and you should be patient in the pursuit of those goals. My therapist once told me that there are just some things that you can't expect from everyone, and that's true. Not everyone is capable of all of the same things. There may be folks in your life who are not going to come to the conclusion that you feel would be best. There needs to be an acknowledgement with grace that we are limited and so too are they, and we ought to be circumspect in the kinds of things that we are attempting to convey. My sister, for example, is a vegan and has been for years. She was a vegetarian before then, and she has acknowledged she will not convert everyone around her to veganism. It's simply not possible. Her sister-in-law is an avowed carnivore who loves chicken and beef. I, frankly, like cheese way too much to become vegan. Like, it's not going to happen. But she is reasonable and patient in her goals. And frankly, one of her broader goals is to encourage us just simply to eat fewer animal products. And that's been very realistic. We've folded her into our life. We are very persuaded to many of the arguments that she's making because I regret to inform you, vegans are kind of right. Like, they're not incorrect from like an ethical and moral perspective. But it didn't require a wholesale turning ourselves over to that particular choice. Crafting that space where people can meet you wherever they are capable of, that's very much the direction that you should be going. And you should also recall that a single argument will probably not change everybody's mind. We have this problem in social scientific research where when we're doing experiments, we'll like show somebody a news clip and see if the news clip like moved the needle on their ideas. And that's not the way any of this works. You don't watch a single news clip and change your mind. You don't encounter a single argument and change your mind. As such, we ought to envision our engagement with folks as part of a series of engagements, not because you're scheduling it, but because this is an ongoing, recurring element. We also should reject moments in which there is bait being thrown to us that would otherwise divert the argument encounter. There are people who are attempting to get a rise out of you. The best example I can normally think of, and this is again foreshadowing next week, is circumstances in which in a mixed gender debate dyad, the female individual being told, listen, you're getting really emotional about this. Well, I wasn't, but now I am. Like that's gonna get a rise. That's the intention, right? It is possible that when people say that, they're genuinely trying to turn the temperature down, but I feel like that explanation lacks credence. They're baiting you. They're trying to divert the conversation. Maybe because they perceive that they are losing, maybe because they don't have something else to say, maybe it's because they're actually just modeling tactics that they had previously seen. They're not intending to be misogynistic. They just believe that this is how you win an argument. And I would encourage you, in the same way that we need to hold ourselves to a high standard of decorum, you don't rise to the bait. Now, as an aside, that is just a hell of a standard that we would hold. That we would say half of the population needs to just be able to shake off or negate a misogynistic attack. If you're a member of the LGBTQ community and you are having a debate with somebody who is firmly of the impression that you should not exist, it is kind of unreasonable to expect that person to be decorous. Like, why would that person be civil? They're arguing with someone who would negate their very life. And yet, in circumstances where we are making a good faith engagement, we should try to bracket those things. We should try to set them aside until it becomes apparent, yeah, no, this is their shtick. This is what they're going to do. This is not going to end as a productive argument because they are not willing to engage me in good faith. We also have to recall that most people are smart. This is actually really, really hard to remember. Not because you don't surround yourself with smart people, but because when we're engaging someone and they have a view that we find unintelligible, just either morally abhorrent or just we cannot square the circle, we cannot figure out how they came to the conclusion that they did, there are plenty of moments in which we need to remember this person is a living, breathing, functioning adult. They do things. They understand the world. And they probably came to this conclusion, perhaps lightly, but at the very least, there is a discernible line of logic that we can detect. And finally, if a person is clearly not willing to change their mind or change their behavior, you ought to seek changes which minimize the importance of their lack of acquiescence. Now, this sounds maybe a little shifty or a little manipulative, but hear me out. So my father-in-law, I don't think could ever be persuaded to be vegan. It's not a thing that he is ever going to accept. And one of the reasons is that this is a real, meat and potatoes kind of person. He is under the impression that it is a meal when it is a protein and then a starch and then no vegetables. No vegetables, sorry. Maybe corn, the starchiest of the vegetables. This individual, however, has been eating vegan at least once a week because everyone around him was like, hey, we're having a vegan night. You're going to be there. You're going to participate. And we'll make sure that it is genuinely good food. We're not just going to serve you like a boiled Brussels sprout or something like that. And that has actually led to a widening of his horizons. In that circumstance, he didn't actually have to agree with veganism. He didn't have to change anything. He just simply had to go along. And honestly, by going along, it's probably softened him in a lot of ways. This notion that we don't actually have to persuade everyone, sometimes we just have to create frameworks where their disagreement does not have an outsized influence on the goings-on of the world, that's a pretty effective strategy if, all things considered, you are unable to truly affect a behavioral or structural change. Now, this is all, again, internally focused. So how do we strong-arm other people to engage in good faith? How do we ensure that our conversation partners are actually engaging us in a way that is worthwhile? Well, first, we need to model patience and reasonableness. In parenting literature, modeling is one of the biggest takeaways because if a child is 3, they simply don't know how to communicate in a way that is socially acceptable. Kids come out of the womb knowing how to communicate, but they got one mode. That's it. It's cry. That is the extent of it. All communication has to be taught, and very often the way that we learn is by emulation. It's by modeling. Frankly, if you engage someone who is otherwise a relatively prickly pear, and you are modeling patience, reasonableness, empathy, a resistance to becoming emotionally dysregulated, people will oftentimes pick up on that cue. Because I'm not saying these folks don't exist, but they're less common than you think. Folks who, in the face of an entirely reasonable opposition, are going to start yelling and raise it up to 11, that's not really a thing. I'm sure that there are those folks, but generally, they're way less common than we would anticipate. And as such, if we model the reasonable behavior, if we set the tone, other folks will normally take their cues from us. It always sounds a little bit weird to be treating our conversation partner like toddlers, but that's where this sort of example is going. Sometimes when a kid is injured and they are screaming their head off, it's actually an index of that being a truly deleterious injury. But very often, their reactions are actually responding to the cues of adults that are around them. If a kid falls and then the immediate response of 3 adults around them is, oh my God, little child, that kid is probably going to be alarmed. But if you adopt a strategy where a kid whacks into something and you go, bonk, or something like that, which was kind of our strategy with our daughter, there's not a large outsized reaction because folks take their cues from others. We also need to work to empathize, even if full understanding is simply not possible. I reference the fact that I do research on public policy, and there are times where I don't understand why some people will advocate with a straight face, with a full, clear voice for some of the positions that they advocate for. Because based on my reading, it is not a tenable position. You are either missing something or your intentions are off. But that is not a productive way to begin the conversation. If I was to walk into a conversation and say, listen, the thing that you believe, it's entirely unreasonable. Can you explain to me why it's not unreasonable? That's not going to go anywhere. That's not going to go the places that we need. So attempting to empathize is very much a first step. Work to understand why an individual perhaps is feeling the way that they are, because very often that is a mechanism to get them to engage you very genuinely. If you ask someone, this is an interesting notion that you've talked about, can you explain to me how you came to this conclusion? A vast majority of them are probably going to engage you. You also need to offer space for objection, but maintain focus in terms of the goal of the argument. There will be times where folks are going to make arguments that you simply cannot intersect with. This occurs very often when you're talking about something like public policy, and an individual is making maybe a religious objection. Many of your defenses for public policy maybe don't consider religious objections to the policy. It's also within the realm of possibility that you're under the impression that religious objections to a policy should be corner cases. They shouldn't actually be governing the way that we end up implementing broadly applicable policies. Instead, maybe there should be carve-outs, or we can rely on the carve-outs that already exist. But telling somebody, listen, we're not going to talk about religion here. You don't get to bring religion into it. That's immediately going to encourage somebody to raise their hackles. Because to ask someone to contain a fundamental part of their identity, of their upbringing, no, that's not actually a good way to engage folks. It will immediately put them on the defensive. So even if a position is something that you fundamentally disagree with, and even if the way that they came to that position is something that you fundamentally disagree with, acknowledging maybe the place from which that logical chain came is perhaps a first step in beginning to unpack it a smidge. And finally, don't be gullible. If a person tells you who they are over and over and over again, you need to listen to them, and you need to take them seriously. Frankly, there are some folks who, within 2 or 3 different conversations, you can determine this is not an individual who I really want at my dinner parties. And that's okay. Not everybody has to attend your dinner party. You are able to be selective about who you engage. And in a circumstance in which this person is truly a gatekeeper, they matter a great deal, well, we can find strategies that make it so their agreement or their acquiescence is less than vital, less than important. On subsequent days, we're going to talk more about emotion, and we're going to talk more about structures of power. Now, the reason that we spend fully half of our time on kind of how we got to this point where productive argument and good faith engagement is like not the status quo, that's encouraging you to think about, well, here's what we can make the status quo. Here's what we can do as a positive intervention to ensure that argument is something that is not nearly as polarizing or deleterious or hard for people to engage. The subsequent 2 class periods are actually going to look more at specific problems, because emotion presents a problem for argument for a lot of folks. And that's not just an understanding of emotion that grounds it as opposed to rationality or something along those lines. It's also that we all can become emotionally dysregulated, and clearly emotion has a place in argument. And then finally, we'll talk about structures of power that may make arguments significantly harder for some folks while not impacting others. And we can talk about maybe how to quarantine those things. It is 7:44. We have roughly 15 minutes left. And as such, I would love to open the floor to questions. That is really the extent of what we have today in terms of good faith engagement. So I would love for an opportunity to extend the conversation at y'all's leisure and thought. As you consider your questions, I'm going to get some water. Yes, sir.
So, Congress as an example, I guess. But it used to be, research me correctly, some time ago, they used to engage in good faith discussions and negotiations, and it seems like that's gone by the wayside.
Yes.
Where did it go off the rails? I know, I hate to hear, when they discussing any topic, and they'll come out and say, well, that's a no-starter.
Yeah, it's a non-starter, yeah.
It just shuts down the negotiations from the get-go.
So some of these things are self-fulfilling prophecies, right? The West Wing, the old Aaron Sorkin program, that's a program that I liked a lot. It's really enjoyable. They talk about Social Security as the third rail of American politics. You don't talk about Social Security, you don't touch Social Security, because that is going to be a place of political problems. Welp. We're in a point where Social Security is not exactly sustainable. It may not be solvent. I'm not going to lie. When we've put together retirement plans, we've kind of had one plan that involves Social Security and one plan that presupposes we won't be getting it. That's not tenable or good. There is no reason Social Security should not be a thing. It is single-handedly a policy responsible for pulling almost more people out of poverty than many other programs that the American government could have implemented. So when we talk about reform being a non-starter, that is definitely like, yeah, you're foreclosing on a conversation before it's even occurred. But social scientists kind of have an answer to your question. Mann and Ornstein make the argument that the dysfunction in Congress, the beginning of this precipitous decline with legislation, with intransigence, with gridlock, it began in the 1990s. And part of that has to do with the structure of the United States government. There are a lot of folks who argue that it is well within the legal rights of a minority party or really any individual acting in Congress to gum up the works. They can do things like filibuster in the Senate, which alters the amount of votes that you're going to require. You can do things like subvert committee hearings, and you can engage in what political scientists call grandstanding behavior, where a particular public committee hearing becomes essentially a way for you to campaign. There are perverse incentives for these kinds of things to occur. And sometimes the only way to truly change them is to alter the structure. In response to a large amount of filibusters, a disproportionate amount of filibusters in the Obama administration, removed the filibuster for a particular subset of judicial nominees. In response, the Republican Party, 2016 onwards, removed the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, which is what was originally retained after Reid removed the filibuster. We're at a point of an escalating almost arms race because constitutional hardball allows you to win, but it does not allow for good faith debate. When you combine that with the fact that we have an active denigration of bipartisanship, and this was most visible in my lifetime in the 2010s, the Tea Party movement, where suddenly to be a person who reached across the aisle, that's a negative attribute in campaigns, that I think altered the dynamic. There are still plenty of people who engage in bipartisanship, but very often there isn't an appetite for it. And that's overdetermined. How do we get to this moment where people actually don't want bipartisanship? It has to do with outrage, it has to do with structures, it has to do with so many different things. But at the bottom, this is a change that's been a long time coming. And we cannot necessarily argue our way out of it. There are particular actors who, once they go away, things will get better. Strom Thurmond, who was a profoundly racist senator, is a good demonstration of a person who, upon their passing, things started getting done. And that is largely because that single individual they had an outsized responsibility in holding things up. That's not exactly the case now. I don't think there's a single politician who we can point to them and be like, you are responsible for these problems. Aside from Rand Paul. We can point at Rand Paul and say those things, but that's about the extent of it, right? So the long and short of the answer to your question is it's taken about 30 years to get to this point. It was a long time coming, and like all structures, it's going to be really hard to change the direction of the ship, But we can get there. It's possible. I feel like you had a question.
How much of this is cultural?
What do you mean?
So a dear friend of mine, so I'm actually, my dad's from India, and so I grew up in a bicultural family, so I've seen different ways of arguing and different approaches. But a dear friend of mine moved to this area, and she was very, very Republican, very, very conservative. At this point, she is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It's been many years. But she said that when she first left home and she started engaging out with media and other things outside of the family, where she'd grown up with conservative talk radio and very emotional, voluble arguments and discussions. But from her descriptions, they were respectful and they were in good faith.
Mm-hmm.
When she started listening to NPR, her impression was that none of the people on there cared about what they were talking about. There was no passion in their arguments.
That's interesting.
They didn't care.
Yeah.
So why are we? So I feel like the two sides are not listening to each other, perhaps for cultural reasons as much as anything.
So part of that is a frame of reference, right? Because if you watched Glenn Beck's old program where he is like literally crying as he's talking about legislation. And then you listen to Nina Totenberg talk about like the Supreme Court. It's like, okay, Glenn Beck cares about this. Nina Totenberg is a robot. Like we don't even know what she would think. So sometimes it's a frame of reference, right? And other times there are like cultural or socialization elements that encourage us to have different standards for levels of engagement. Because like my partner and I have a relationship where sometimes when we argue, people will be like, Are you okay? Like, is this like a domestic dispute? And it's not because we're throwing hands, but it's because there may be like a snappiness or an engagement that some folks associate with anger or a lack of safety, and it just happens to work for us. If you came, for example, from a household that had somewhat authoritarian tendencies where disagreement was frowned upon, that is probably going to structure your outlook and your understanding of, well, what can productive disagreement look like? I always hesitate to say that something is cultural because cultural is like a fractal thing. Like there are microcultures that maybe subvert the expectations of like a broader dominant culture. But I do think that those calibrate our expectations for argument. They calibrate what we think about as civility. They actually sometimes calibrate our willingness to do things like push back against authority figures. And as such, it's well within the realm of possibility that a person could encounter a different sociocultural moment and think, wow, this is unintelligible to me. And that could actually be then refiltered through their view of politics. That just kind of requires an acknowledgement that like, there are many paths to the temple. Like there are a lot of different ways to argue. And as long as both parties are like accepting of the conditions, I don't think there's necessarily a wrong way. It's only when some people are not consenting to the engagement that instead of having, a boxing match, you have assault and battery, if that makes sense. Yes, sir.
How can you argue against Barack Obama was not born in USA?
Well, if only he'd produced the birth certificate. No. So this is a great question, right? This is a persistent conspiracy theory that occurred in the 2010s, 2011, circa then, and it was not put to rest by the establishment of a long-form birth certificate or something along those lines. It is possible that there can be legitimate questions about whether or not, for example, a person is eligible to run for the presidency. For example, Ted Cruz has dual citizenship. Like, there is a conversation to be had about whether or not that implicates his ability to run for president. The spoiler is it doesn't at all. It's not a problem. And yet, that is a conversation that we can have and then dispatch with. I think that the way that you rebut that, the way that you argue against it, is not actually by arguing the facts, but by isolating the patterns, right? Donald Trump was saying that Nikki Haley, somehow it's questionable whether or not she can ascend to the presidency. This is an individual who has said these things over and over and over again. It doesn't really matter who the political opponent is. He will invent a reason to make that contention. This is an instance, and I'm not attempting to accuse the former president of always engaging in bad faith, but this is a moment where we don't actually have a reason to rebut that claim seriously, because serious refutation would not change his willingness to disperse it. The point at which you refute is the point at which you believe that refutation will actually meaningfully alter the trajectory of what somebody is saying. And if somebody insists over and over and over again that a factually inaccurate statement is truly a representation of the world, that person kind of needs to be contained from a broader conversation and argument. And there's a reason that Trump was banned from, at the time, Twitter, now X, after 2021. Because that individual, Donald Trump, was actually responsible for an outsized amount of disinformation that was occurring on the platform. One study indicated that specific disinformation pertaining to the election decreased by 70% upon Trump being banned from the platform. We've isolated not a problem with the argument, but a problem with the actor. And in those circumstances, we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that this is about argument. This is about power. It's about who has a voice. And if we are capable of minimizing the spread of that particular voice, that's a moment where we don't have to change somebody's mind. They can continue to do their thing. They're just not entitled to an audience. That's probably not a very satisfying answer, but it's the one I got. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that coercion is not a good faith argument, but then you also mentioned that you used coercion with your grandparents to see your child.
Yeah.
And you kind of implied that that was in good faith because you were trying to explain the gravity, but you were still using coercion. How does that all fit together?
So sometimes it feels like coercion when we point out social consequences, because we are saying, if you do this, a negative externality will be visited upon you. That sounds like coercion. The difficulty there is that we were making an argument about safety. We were saying, this individual, this entity is not safe based off of your behaviors. And if you do not alter those behaviors, we have to keep this person safe. That is very much a rubber meets the road. If you do not acknowledge this, if you do not do this, you can't pass go. But that is actually a choice that we gave them. We essentially said, you can do this and have access to this child. You can encounter them because you will be a safe entity to do so. Or you can choose not to do that until they've been vaccinated, until they're able to protect themselves. That is coercive, and it is manipulative in the sense that we were telling them, yeah, a negative externality will be visited upon you if you don't do the thing that we are asking to. But in the same breath, that was not me threatening them with, you will never see this child, or we will engage in a disproportionate, unrelated response to that which you were saying. If someone is fundamentally against the existence of trans individuals, and there is a trans member of their family, and they say to them, listen, I simply cannot be around you unless you can guarantee that you view me as a human being, some would say that that's coercive. But one party has to protect themselves in that context. They're not saying, I'm going to visit violence upon you, I'm going to come to your house and beat you. They're instead saying, I'm going to remove myself. I'm going to no longer engage you if you do not take seriously the thing that I am saying. The line between coercion and persuasion in that instance, I think to your point, blurred. Very, very difficult to navigate. But in the same breath, that felt defensible because of the stakes. And sometimes the stakes are high enough that it warrants a conversation about social consequences or consequences for one's family. It's a valid point, though. I'm sorry, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah. Would that mean that some amount of coercion can sometimes be justified?
I mean, I'm not a philosophy major, so some amount of anything is probably justified at some point, you know? But no, at the bottom, I do think that these things are all contextual, right? Because what some people might interpret as coercion may actually just be a reminder of your actions having consequences. And I would argue that reminding people that they are accountable to others because we live in a society, that's not fundamentally coercive. Some people might think that it is. And there, I think, is a definition, perhaps, of coercion that is so delimited as to actually encompass that. But I think that that is a situated, defensible way to approach the conversation. And the way that I think I can justify it is through the stakes. If I was doing that on something arbitrary, like if you don't get me this Christmas present, you can't come to Christmas, obviously not acceptable because the stakes are so low and they're an arbitrary imposition of a barrier. But in these other contexts, it's not unreasonable to remind folks, yeah, you have an obligation to others. And if you choose to reject that obligation, I'm not actually under any obligation to you in that way. We are at 8:00, and I really appreciate y'all's time. Thank you, and I hope to see you all next week. It's a great question. Thank you.